Good evening. We begin tonight with a wave of violent attacks that have swept across multiple American cities in what officials are calling a coordinated lone wolf terror campaign. These assaults, inspired by online radicalization and anti-Israel rhetoric, have left communities in mourning and authorities scrambling to assess the full scope of the threat. We warn our viewers, some of the footage you are about to see is disturbing. The most devastating attack occurred in Los Angeles, where a driver intentionally plowed into a crowd outside a pro-Israel demonstration. 12 people were killed, including children and elderly attendees. Authorities confirmed the suspect, a 28-year-old with a history of online extremism, was inspired by radicalized social media content. Law enforcement sources tell us they found encrypted messages on the suspect's phone linking him to extremist Telegram channels promoting Global Intifada rhetoric.
Make no mistake, this was an act of terrorism. The suspect deliberately targeted a peaceful demonstration with the intent to kill as many people as possible. This is a direct result of extremist propaganda encouraging violence on our soil.
Meanwhile, in Chicago, a masked attacker stabbed an Orthodox Jewish man in broad daylight before disappearing into the crowd. Surveillance footage captured the suspect, dressed in black, approaching the victim from behind and striking multiple times before fleeing. Let's take a look at that footage. The victim, a 52-year-old father of 3, is in critical condition. Chicago police say the attacker used a makeshift weapon, potentially a box cutter or a homemade blade. No arrests have been made, and the suspect remains at large. And in a deeply disturbing pattern, multiple Jewish schools across the country have been set ablaze in apparent arson attacks. Fires broke out at institutions in Florida, Texas, and California, with investigators suspecting coordinated efforts. Authorities are examining whether these attacks are linked to the growing online campaign urging violence against Jewish communities.
This wasn't just vandalism. This was meant to send a message, to terrorize us. My son's classroom is gone. We got lucky this time. What if they come back?
These attacks mark the first major escalation of what security analysts are calling a global intifada movement taking root in the U.S., inspired by a combination of radical Islamist propaganda and far-left militant activism. This movement is pushing individuals toward acts of terrorism. Federal agencies are now monitoring a surge in encrypted online chatter urging further violence. FBI Director Kash Patel addressed the nation today.
This is not spontaneous. These acts of terror are the result of a deliberate effort to radicalize individuals in the United States. We are witnessing the digital spread of violent extremism, and we will not allow these threats to take root in our communities.
Security experts warn this is just the beginning. Online extremist networks have been ramping up calls for violence since last year, and recent conflicts in the Middle East have only fueled the fire. With protests growing more radical and law enforcement stretched thin, the concern now is what comes next. Will we see an escalation beyond lone wolf attacks? Could organized cells begin operating on American soil?
We've seen this before. Lone wolves are often the opening act. These attackers are testing law enforcement responses, spreading fear, and laying the groundwork for more sophisticated operations. If we don't act now, we could see coordinated bombings, mass shootings, or even targeted assassinations in the near future.
For now, Americans are being urged to remain vigilant. Authorities are increasing security at places of worship, Jewish-owned businesses, and public events. But the question remains, are we ready for what comes next? We'll continue our coverage as this developing situation unfolds. Stay with us. We'll be right back after this break. Good evening. We begin tonight with breaking news from Washington, D.C., where a night of music and celebration turned into horror. A well-coordinated terrorist attack, reportedly carried out by Hamas and Hezbollah-affiliated operatives along with domestic radical leftist extremists, has left at least 120 dead and dozens more injured at a concert venue near downtown. Authorities are calling it one of the deadliest terrorist incidents on American soil since 9/11. This was the scene just moments after gunmen stormed the venue, opening fire indiscriminately on the crowd. Witnesses describe a nightmarish situation. Heavily armed attackers entered the building, executing concert-goers at close range and holding others hostage. Authorities say they were met with return fire from law enforcement before the final gunmen were neutralized in a dramatic shootout. Authorities are now working to piece together exactly how this attack was planned, and more importantly, how these terrorists made their way into the country. Early reports suggest that several of the attackers crossed the U.S.-Mexico border illegally in recent months, potentially exploiting weaknesses in national security to infiltrate American cities. Intelligence officials had previously raised red flags about suspected Middle Eastern operatives using cartel-controlled smuggling routes to enter the country, but tonight's attack underscores just how severe that threat has become. Sources indicate that the attackers coordinated through encrypted messaging apps, possibly taking direct inspiration from previous mass casualty attacks such as the 2015 Bataclan massacre in Paris. In a chilling parallel to the Bataclan attack, survivors say the terrorists shouted extremist slogans before opening fire on the crowd. One witness describes the moment she realized what was happening.
They just started shooting. They weren't robbing anyone, they weren't making demands, they just wanted to kill as many people as possible. They were shouting stuff about Palestine, about Zionists. I tried to hide under a seat, but they were going row by row, just executing people.
The FBI, Homeland Security, and local authorities are now investigating the attackers' affiliations. Officials believe this could be part of a broader wave of terror attacks dubbed the Global Intifada, a movement that has been gaining traction in radical left-wing and jihadist circles over the past year. Tonight's attack is just the latest escalation in what some analysts are calling a low-level insurgency forming inside the United States. In the past months, Jewish community centers, synagogues, and pro-Israel rallies have been targeted in acts of violence. Now, intelligence officials fear that radical leftist groups and foreign terrorist networks are converging to bring large-scale terror to American cities. We are now learning more about the attackers themselves. At least 2 of them were known to authorities, with ties to radical activist groups in the U.S. One of them, identified as Jamal al-Masri, had previously been arrested for participating in violent protests but was released without charges. The other, Omar Haddad, entered the U.S. illegally last year and was flagged by border officials but ultimately released due to current immigration policies.
We have long warned that terrorist groups would exploit our weakened border security. This attack proves that the threat is not hypothetical, it's happening now. We need decisive action to secure our borders and prevent further infiltration.
The White House has released a statement condemning the attack, vowing swift action to prevent further incidents. President Trump is expected to address the nation later tonight. As the country mourns the victims of tonight's attack, many are left asking, how did we let this happen? Could this have been prevented? And what will it take to ensure that Americans are safe from the growing threat of radicalized violence? Our coverage continues with expert analysis on what this means for national security, the role of foreign terror networks, and the broader implications of radical extremism taking hold on American soil. Stay with us as we bring you the latest updates throughout the night. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. We begin tonight with breaking news of a dangerous new extremist group that has emerged within the United States. Calling itself Intifada United States or IUS, the coalition of radical leftists, anarchists, and Islamist extremists has claimed responsibility for a wave of violent attacks on government buildings and law enforcement facilities. Authorities are scrambling to respond, and the FBI has officially labeled the group a domestic terrorist organization. The group, reportedly inspired by Palestinian uprisings of the past, has already carried out multiple bombings in key cities. Their targets: police stations, federal courthouses, and other government institutions. Let's take a look at the latest attack in Washington, D.C., where a federal building was struck by an explosive device late last night. This was the scene at 2:17 a.m. when an explosive device detonated outside the IRS headquarters here in the nation's capital. Witnesses describe a loud blast that shook nearby buildings and sent debris flying across the street. No casualties have been reported, but the damage to the building is extensive, and authorities are now treating this as a coordinated terrorist act. The attack in Washington is just one of several across the country. Cities like Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles have also seen similar bombings, all following the same pattern: late-night explosions targeting symbols of federal or local authority. Officials say IUS is using encrypted online channels to spread propaganda and recruit new members. The FBI has launched a nationwide manhunt, urging the public to stay vigilant.
We are dealing with a well-organized, highly radicalized group that is actively targeting the institutions that uphold law and order in this country. We are urging citizens to report any suspicious activity and to avoid spreading unverified information that could aid the perpetrators.
But just who are the people behind Intifada United States? Experts say the group appears to be a hybrid of extremist factions, some with ideological ties to anarchist movements, others to Islamist militancy. Intelligence analysts believe the group's leadership operates through decentralized cells, making it difficult for law enforcement to track their activities.
What makes IUS so dangerous is its ability to unite ideologically disparate groups under a common cause: opposing the U.S. government. They are leveraging social media and encrypted messaging apps to coordinate attacks, much like ISIS or other past terror organizations.
In response to the escalating attacks, the Department of Homeland Security has raised the national terror threat level, and counterterrorism units have been deployed in major cities. The White House is expected to address the situation in the coming hours. For now, officials are urging calm but say they will use every available resource to dismantle this new domestic threat. As this situation develops, we will continue to bring you the latest updates. Stay with American News Outreach for ongoing coverage. Up next, how social media is fueling extremist movements and what platforms are doing to crack down on terrorist propaganda. Stay with us. Good evening. We begin tonight with a developing national security crisis. December 2026 has brought an unprecedented wave of coordinated attacks on U.S. infrastructure, intelligence officials now confirming links to Iranian-backed sleeper cells operating within the country. Authorities are scrambling to assess the full scale of the damage as emergency response teams work to restore critical services. The most devastating attack so far occurred in the Midwest, where a major fuel pipeline was bombed overnight. The explosion sent fireballs into the sky, causing widespread fuel shortages and price spikes at gas stations across multiple states. Officials fear it could take weeks to repair. Here's what we know so far.
This was a deliberate act of sabotage, and we are treating it as a terrorist attack. We are working with federal and local partners to ensure the security of our nation's energy infrastructure and to prevent further incidents.
Meanwhile, in what appears to be a coordinated assault, power substations in both New York and Texas were attacked, leading to rolling blackouts in several major cities. The Department of Energy has deployed rapid response teams, but residents in some areas are being warned of extended outages. In New York City, commuters found themselves in chaos as traffic signals went dark and subway services faced disruptions. Similar scenes played out in Houston, where temperatures dipped below freezing overnight, leaving thousands without heating.
I woke up, and everything was out. No heat, no lights. We tried to get gas for a generator, but the stations were either closed or packed. It's like nothing works right now.
And it's not just physical infrastructure under attack. A wave of cyber attacks targeting American financial institutions has sent shockwaves through Wall Street. Banking systems have been disrupted, and stock markets have been in turmoil for days.
This is the worst cyber assault on U.S. markets we've ever seen. Hackers flooded systems with malicious code, causing trading halts and financial losses in the billions. The federal government and private sector are scrambling to contain the damage.
With tensions rising, President Trump addressed the nation earlier today, vowing swift retaliation and reinforcing security measures across the country. As investigators work to unravel the full scope of these attacks, authorities are urging the public to remain vigilant. We will continue to bring you the latest updates as this situation unfolds. Stay with us for further coverage after the break. Good evening, I'm Rachel Matthews, and tonight we bring you a troubling development. A growing number of military-aged men, radicalized through social media and encrypted messaging platforms like Telegram, are traveling to the Middle East for so-called training, only to return to the U.S. What does this mean for national security? And what, if anything, can be done to stop it? We begin with an inside look at how these individuals are being recruited and why officials say the threat is rising. Federal intelligence officials say online radicalization is nothing new, but the pace and scale of recruitment have surged in the past year. Encrypted channels promote militant ideology, while influencers push propaganda that portrays travel to conflict zones as a rite of passage.
We're seeing these men being recruited under the guise of self-defense training or preparing for an inevitable conflict. They're lured in by flashy content, combat footage, testimonials, even promises of brotherhood and purpose. But the concern is what happens when they return.
Homeland Security sources confirm that multiple individuals suspected of receiving paramilitary training abroad have returned to the U.S. in recent months. Officials warn that while not all of them will act, some may pose a long-term security risk.
We are monitoring these cases very closely. Our primary concern is individuals returning with combat experience, operational knowledge, and connections to extremist networks.
Federal and local law enforcement have already made several arrests linked to this trend. In one recent case, a 29-year-old man from Ohio was taken into custody after allegedly attempting to provide material support to a foreign militant group. Authorities say he had traveled to Syria last year for training and returned with plans to recruit others.
I mean,
I never would have suspected anything. He was quiet, kept to himself. But looking back, yeah, he did start talking a lot about the government and being ready for something big.
Lawmakers are now calling for stricter measures to prevent radicalized individuals from leaving or re-entering the country. Proposed solutions include enhanced screening of travelers, increased surveillance of online extremist spaces, and expanded counter-radicalization efforts. As officials race to respond, the question remains, how do you combat an enemy that recruits in the shadows, trains overseas, and then blends back into American life? We'll continue following this story as new developments unfold. For now, I'm Rachel Matthews. Stay with us for more coverage, and coming up next, a look at the growing concerns over AI-driven disinformation campaigns, how they're shaping public perception in 2027.